I was 62 years old when my world fell apart. There's no poetic way to say it. One day I had a family, a house, and a job, and the next, I was standing in an empty living room holding a half-filled box of my things, wondering how everything had disappeared so quietly. My wife, Mary, stood by the door, her suitcase beside her feet. Her eyes weren't angry, that was the strange part. They were tired, like someone who had been fighting a silent war for too long. "John," she said softly, "I can't do this anymore." Those words echoed in my head for months. I can't do this anymore. I didn't argue, I didn't beg. Maybe a younger version of me would have. But at 62, when the person you love tells you they've run out of love, you realize there's no fixing it. Our kids had long moved out, 2 sons and a daughter, all busy building their own lives in other states. I'd always been the distant type, too focused on work to notice the birthdays I missed or the promises I broke. When Mary left, they didn't call to check on me. Not out of cruelty, just indifference. I'd built my life around the wrong kind of success, and now there was no one left to share it with. That night after she left, I sat on the couch and listened to the quiet. The house felt hollow. Every tick of the clock was a reminder of how empty it had become. I tried turning on the TV, but the noise felt intrusive. I made coffee just to have something to do, but even that tasted like loneliness. The next day, I went to work as usual. I was an operations manager at a logistics company, a job I'd held for 25 years. I knew every corner of that warehouse, every sound the forklifts made, every smell of oil and cardboard. But things were changing. The younger guys were faster, cheaper, and more comfortable with the new software I could barely understand. A month later, they let me go. Corporate restructuring, they called it. I walked out with a cardboard box in my arms, filled with 25 years of memories that suddenly meant nothing. A coffee mug, a photo of my team from 2008, and a few tools I'd kept in my drawer just in case. That night, the silence of my apartment felt unbearable. I stared at the ceiling and thought about how quickly a life can unravel. At 62, people tell you it's time to slow down, enjoy retirement, play golf. But what if you've got nothing left to retire into? For a while, I let myself drown in routine, morning walks to nowhere, endless cups of coffee, mindless scrolling through the internet. I stopped shaving. I stopped answering calls. I told myself it was rest, but deep down, I knew it was surrender. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. It was raining, one of those heavy spring rains that soaks everything in minutes. I was walking to the gas station near my apartment to grab a cheap dinner when I saw it, an old, beaten-up red Mustang parked behind the station. The paint was peeling, one of the tires was flat, and the headlights looked foggy, like tired eyes. But even in that miserable condition, it had character. It reminded me of a time long before spreadsheets and performance reports, back when I used to fix cars in my father's garage as a teenager. I stopped under the rain, just staring at it. I remembered the feeling of turning a wrench, the sound of an engine coming back to life after hours of work. I hadn't touched a car in over 40 years, yet my fingers twitched like they remembered every motion. The gas station clerk came out for a smoke and saw me looking at it. "That thing," he said, laughing, "been sitting there for months. Some guy dumped it and never came back. It's a piece of junk." Maybe it was, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of that car stuck in my mind. I didn't know why, maybe because it looked like me. Broken, forgotten, covered in rust, but still standing. The next morning I went back and asked the clerk who owned it. He shrugged and gave me a number. After a few phone calls, I found the owner, a young guy who'd moved to another state and didn't want to deal with the paperwork. "I'll take it off your hands," I said. "How much?" he asked. $200. He laughed. "Sure, if you can get it out of there." I borrowed a tow truck from a friend of a friend, and had it delivered to a small storage unit I'd been renting for years. The space smelled of dust and old paint, the kind of smell that carries memories. When I lifted the hood for the first time, I felt like I was seeing an old friend. The engine was a mess, rusted, clogged, half of it missing, but I didn't care. I cleaned it slowly, wiping away years of grime, as if I were erasing the time I'd lost. Every bolt I turned reminded me that I was still capable of doing something real. No meetings, no emails, no pretending. Just me, my tools, and a machine that refused to die. It took me weeks to get it running again. I watched tutorial videos on my old laptop, read forums, ordered parts from eBay. My hands hurt, my back ached, and I made 1,000 mistakes. But when that engine finally roared to life, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: pride. I didn't just fix a car that day, I fixed a part of myself. I sat in the driver's seat, the rain tapping on the roof, and laughed like a madman. I wasn't rich, I wasn't young, but I was alive. That's when I knew I wasn't done yet. I woke up the next morning to sore hands and a new sense of purpose. It's funny, I had no money, no job, no family around me, but I had a reason to get out of bed again. The Mustang was waiting for me, and for the first time in months, I wasn't just existing. I was building something, even if it was just a piece of scrap metal in a dusty garage. When I opened the storage door, the morning sun spilled in through the narrow slit of the roof vent, hitting the red hood of that car. Dust particles floated like tiny stars, and I smiled. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I started cleaning the garage, organizing the old tools I hadn't touched in years. Some of them had belonged to my father. I could still see his initials, WH, carved into one of the wrenches. He was the one who taught me how to fix things when I was a kid, back before life got complicated. I remember his voice. "A man's hands tell his story, son. Some tell it in words, others tell it in work." For years, I'd ignored that lesson, thinking that success meant suits and offices. Now, holding that same wrench, I realized how far I'd drifted from the man I once wanted to be. The first few weeks were brutal. The Mustang fought back with every bolt I tried to loosen. I stripped screws, broke sockets, burned my fingers on hot parts I forgot were hot. I bled, I cursed, I laughed. But every mistake became a lesson, and every small progress, a reason to keep going. When I finally replaced the starter, and the car made its first weak cough, it felt like the heartbeat of something greater. The second time I turned the key, it sputtered. The third time, it roared. That sound filled the small garage like a choir. I swear, it was the most beautiful noise I'd ever heard. I didn't know what I'd do with it: sell it, keep it, or maybe just drive it until it fell apart again. But as I sat behind the wheel, I realized it wasn't about the car anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could still bring something back to life. The neighbors started noticing. Old Mr. Price from down the block walked by one day and said, "Didn't think anyone still fixed their own cars around here." I told him I was anyone. I was someone trying to remember what living felt like. He chuckled and asked if I could take a look at his old Chevy that hadn't run in years. That was the first time someone paid me for what I loved doing. $300. It wasn't much, but when he handed me the cash, I felt richer than I'd ever felt in my office job. There was something honest about it: sweat, effort, results. A fair exchange between people who respected each other's time. After that, more people came. A neighbor's son wanted an oil change. Someone's cousin had a broken radiator. Word spread quietly, the way good things do. I didn't even advertise. I just showed up every day, kept the garage clean, and treated people with kindness. But it wasn't all easy. Some days I'd wake up with back pain so bad I could barely stand. Other days, loneliness would creep in like an uninvited guest. There were moments I sat on the floor of the garage staring at the wall, thinking, what the hell am I doing? Yet every time I thought about quitting, I'd hear that Mustang engine in my head, that deep rumble of something reborn, and I'd keep going. One night I called my daughter. She didn't pick up. I left a message anyway. Hey, it's Dad. I'm fixing cars again. Can you believe that? No reply came, but leaving that message felt like a step not toward her, but toward forgiving myself. By the end of that year, I had repaired 6 cars. 6 broken things that people had given up on. And maybe, just maybe, fixing them was my way of fixing myself. I began to dream again. I started sketching ideas in an old notebook. What if I turned this garage into a real business? A place where people could come not just for repairs, but for respect. No scams, no overcharging, no judgment, just honest work. But dreams, I learned, don't build themselves. They ask for sacrifice. So I sold the Mustang. I didn't want to, but it was the only way to gather enough money to rent a small commercial space. The buyer, a retired veteran, promised he'd take care of it, and when he drove away, I stood there watching that red car disappear down the street. It felt like saying goodbye to a friend who'd saved my life. The new garage was tiny, but to me it was a kingdom. I painted the walls white, hung up a simple sign, Harris Auto Care, and bought a used coffee machine for customers. I printed flyers at the library and handed them out myself, one by one. The first week, no one came. The second week, one customer showed up, a woman with a flat tire and tears in her eyes because she couldn't afford the dealership's prices. I fixed it for free. She cried again, but this time out of gratitude. 2 days later, she brought her brother, and he brought a friend. That's how it began, not with luck but with kindness. There were nights I slept in that garage, listening to the ticking sound of cooling engines and the soft hum of the refrigerator. The smell of oil became my companion, and the rhythm of wrenches my therapy. I started each day at sunrise, sweeping the floor, brewing cheap coffee, turning on the old radio. Sometimes old songs came on, ones Mary used to hum while cleaning the kitchen. They hit hard. I missed her, even after everything. But I stopped wishing for the past to come back. Some things aren't meant to be repaired, they're meant to be released. Months passed. I got stronger physically and mentally. I learned how to order parts smarter, manage time better, talk to customers without fear. The wrinkles on my face didn't fade, but the heaviness behind them did. I found peace in repetition, the sound of ratchets, the smell of grease, the soft slam of a car door closing just right. Each repair was a small victory. Each customer who smiled was proof that I still mattered. One evening, a young man named Diego stopped by. He was 26, fresh out of trade school looking for a job. I can work for cheap, he said, just need experience. I looked at him and saw a reflection of who I used to be, hungry, uncertain, but full of energy. I hired him on the spot. That decision changed everything. Diego became like a son to me. He worked hard, learned fast, and treated every car with respect. He showed me how to use social media, posted photos of our repairs, shared stories, and within months, we had regular customers from 3 towns over. People liked our honesty. They liked that we were small, personal, human. We worked late most nights, laughing, arguing, learning from each other. Sometimes we'd finish a job and just sit outside the garage, drinking cold soda and watching the sunset reflect on the windshields. He once asked me, "John, do you ever wish you started this earlier?" I smiled and said, "No, if I had, I wouldn't have appreciated it like I do now. Some things need time to teach you what they're worth." And I meant it. By the end of that second year, Harris Auto Care wasn't just surviving, it was alive. We had customers who brought us pies for Thanksgiving, neighbors who waved every morning, and enough money to pay rent on time. I still lived simply, small apartment, modest meals. But every day I walked into that shop with gratitude. Gratitude that I got a second chance. Gratitude that the universe hadn't given up on me, even when I had. The first few months at the garage were nothing short of chaos. My hands remembered what to do, but my body didn't always keep up. My back hurt after hours of leaning over the hood of an old Ford, and sometimes I dropped tools because of the slight tremor in my fingers. But there was something magical in that discomfort. It reminded me I was alive, that I was working towards something that mattered again. The shop itself was modest. A single-bay garage with cracked concrete floors and walls stained from years of oil and smoke. The sign outside still bore the name of the old owner, Henderson Auto Repair. I didn't have the money to change it, so I left it as it was. I told myself I'd earned the right to put my own name up there one day. Customers came slowly at first. Most were locals who just happened to drive by and saw the lights on late at night. I'd offer fair prices, sometimes too fair, just to keep people coming back. I remember one old lady, Mrs. Patterson, who brought in her rusted Chevrolet Malibu. She looked at me suspiciously and asked, "Are you new here? I thought this place closed years ago." I smiled, wiping my hands on a rag. Guess it just needed a little fixing, like the rest of us. She laughed, and that small laugh. It was the first sound of approval I'd heard in a long time. There were tough days. Some mornings I'd come to the shop and find no cars at all, not even a single call. I'd sit by the open door, sipping cheap coffee, watching the sun rise over the empty street. The doubt always crept in then. Was I fooling myself? Could a 61-year-old man really rebuild his life from scratch? One day, as I sat there lost in thought, a young man pulled up in a busted-up Honda Civic. He couldn't have been older than 22. "You do bodywork here?" he asked. "A little," I replied. He hesitated before saying, "I can't afford much, but I need this car to get to my new job." I looked at him, and for a moment I saw myself at that age, broke, uncertain, desperate for a chance. I told him to leave it and pay me what he could. I stayed until midnight patching that thing up, welding panels and sanding until the paint caught a bit of shine. When he came the next morning, he just stood there, mouth open. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "Just do good at that new job," I told him. "That's payment enough." That night when I locked the garage, I realized something powerful. Helping others helped me heal. Every car I fixed, every person I helped, filled that void my family's absence had left behind. A few weeks later, word started spreading. People came not just because of my prices, but because they trusted me. They'd bring their cars, sit in the shop, drink coffee, and tell stories. My garage wasn't just a business, it became a small community. I started writing their names and stories in a notebook I kept under the counter. Tom, single dad, Chevy truck, works night shifts. Linda, retired teacher, still drives her old Pontiac. Each name reminded me why I was doing this. These weren't just cars. These were people's lives on wheels. Then came the day that changed everything. A man named Rick pulled in driving a faded red Mustang. "You the new mechanic?" he asked, stepping out with a smile. "Something like that," I said. He told me he restored old cars as a hobby and was looking for someone to partner with. "You've got good hands," he said after watching me work. "Ever think about doing rebuilds for resale?" That night the idea wouldn't leave my head. Restoring cars, not just fixing them but bringing them back to life, had always been my dream. It was what I did with my dad when I was young. We work on his old pickup for hours, just the two of us, talking about life, about the future. That memory still smelled like oil and sunlight. So I said yes. Rick and I started small, buying broken-down cars from auctions, fixing them up in my shop, and selling them for a modest profit. The first one we sold was a 1972 Chevy C10. When we handed the keys to the buyer, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: pride. Not the shallow kind, but the kind that comes when you build something with your own two hands. Every sale, every satisfied customer fueled the fire. My savings grew, but more importantly, so did my confidence. The old man who had once thought his life was over was now working 10-hour days, smiling while covered in grease. And one evening, when I switched off the lights and looked at the reflection of the garage window, I realized something else. I wasn't alone anymore. People started to believe in me, and slowly I began to believe in myself too. Business grew faster than I could have imagined. Within a year, what started as a one-man operation in a dusty old garage had turned into a steady stream of customers and restoration projects. Word spread through the town and beyond, not through fancy ads or social media, but through people. Real people. One satisfied customer told another, and then another, until one day I realized I was booking repairs 2 weeks in advance. Rick and I worked side by side most days. He handled the auction deals, finding cars with good bones but bad luck, while I focused on the mechanical side. The first few rebuilds were tough. Sometimes we barely broke even after buying parts, paint, and tools. But every time a car rolled out of the shop shining like new, it felt like victory. The first real turning point came when a local news station featured us in a weekend segment called Second Chances. They told my story, how an old man who'd lost everything started over by doing what he loved. The segment was only 5 minutes long, but it changed everything. Calls came in from nearby towns and even a few from out of state. People didn't just want their cars fixed, they wanted to meet the man who didn't give up. That night after the story aired, I sat in my small office at the back of the shop, surrounded by the hum of cooling engines. For the first time, I cried, not out of sadness, but out of overwhelming gratitude. The loneliness that had once haunted me had been replaced by something new: purpose. Rick walked in and handed me a beer. "You did it, old man," he said with a grin. I laughed. "No, we did it." He raised his bottle. "To second chances." "To second chances," I echoed, clinking my bottle against his. With more work came bigger decisions. We expanded the garage, added another bay, upgraded our tools, and even hired a young apprentice named Lewis. He was just 19, full of energy and questions. Watching him work reminded me of myself decades ago. "Mr. Dale," he asked one afternoon while tightening a bolt, "why'd you start this so late in life? Most people your age are thinking about retiring." I smiled, leaning against the workbench. "Because I spent too many years working for someone else's dream. This one's mine." He nodded slowly, like he was storing the words somewhere deep. I hoped he'd remember them someday. Then came the business side of things, the part I'd always avoided. I had to learn about licensing, taxes, online listings, even customer reviews. Rick handled most of the paperwork, but I forced myself to understand it. If you want to own something, I told myself, you need to run it, not hide behind someone else. Before long, we had a rhythm. I'd spend mornings fixing cars, afternoons inspecting auction finds, and evenings talking with customers. Some nights, I stayed late just to stand in the quiet and look at the lineup of cars: old Mustangs, Camaros, Chevys, and Fords, each one a story reborn. Then one day, a black Mercedes pulled into the lot. Out stepped my son, Mark. I hadn't seen him in nearly 6 years. "Dad," he said awkwardly. "Mark," I replied, my heart racing. He looked around, taking in the shop, the cars, the smell of oil. "I saw the TV piece," he said. "Didn't think I'd ever see you on the news." I chuckled nervously. Didn't think I'd ever be on the news. There was a long silence. He finally said, "Mom told me what happened back then. I didn't understand it at the time." "It's okay," I said softly. "I wasn't the man I should have been." He looked down. "You seem different now." I had to lose everything to remember who I was. He nodded slowly. "I'm proud of you, Dad." Those words hit me harder than any heartbreak ever could. They broke something open inside me, not pain, but release. For years, I'd carried guilt like an anchor. That moment cut the rope. We stood there in silence for a while, then he smiled. "So, you really fix these up?" "Want to see how it's done?" I asked. He shrugged. "Why not?" That day we worked side by side, just like I used to with my own father. Different tools, same feeling. Months passed and business continued to grow. We started taking online orders, shipping rebuilt classics to collectors across the country. The first time I saw a car we restored appear in a magazine, I framed the page and hung it in the office. Under it, I wrote with a black marker, "Never stop rebuilding cars or life." I was 64 years old, busier than ever, and happier than I'd been in decades. My back still hurt, my hands were scarred, and I didn't have the energy of my youth, but none of that mattered. Every morning I woke up excited. People used to tell me it was too late, but what they didn't understand is that starting late isn't the same as starting wrong. I wasn't chasing money or success anymore, I was chasing fulfillment. And I had finally caught it. I turned 68 the year I realized I didn't need more. More cars, more money, more attention. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was time. Time spent doing what I loved. Time spent with people who gave life meaning again. The garage was now more than a business. It was a living memory of everything I'd fought through. We had 3 full bays, 2 apprentices, and a waiting list long enough to fill the calendar months ahead. I'd walk in every morning to the hum of engines, the smell of metal and oil, and the sight of young hands learning what mine once knew by heart. Sometimes I'd stand at the entrance, coffee in hand, and watch the sunrise stretch across the chrome hoods lined up outside. I'd think back to those nights I spent alone, wondering if I'd ever feel whole again. And every time I'd smile, because I had built this life from the ruins of the old one. Mark started visiting more often. At first he came once a month, then once a week. He brought his kids, my grandkids, who loved to run around the shop pretending to be mechanics. The first time little Emma handed me a wrench and said, "Here, Grandpa," I almost lost it. There's no award, no business milestone that can compare to that moment. One day, while we were working on a vintage Mustang, Mark said, "You ever think about slowing down?" I laughed. "And do what? Watch TV all day?" He smiled. "You've earned a rest." "Maybe," I said, "but as long as I can turn a wrench, I'm not done." He nodded. "Guess stubbornness runs in the family." "Call it passion," I replied with a grin. As business grew, I found myself doing something unexpected, mentoring others. Not just young mechanics, but men and women my age who came by asking how I did it. Some had just lost their jobs, others had retired and didn't know what to do next. They'd sit across from me, eyes full of fear I knew too well. I'd tell them the truth. I didn't have a plan. I had pain and I turned it into purpose. That's all you need to start. One man, a former accountant named George, started his own motorcycle repair shop after our talks. Another woman, a retired teacher, began restoring vintage furniture in her garage. Every time someone sent me a message saying, "You inspired me to start over," it felt like my story had come full circle. I wasn't just fixing cars anymore. I was helping people rebuild themselves. There was a day I'll never forget. A man in his 70s came to the shop driving a beaten-up Ford pickup. He asked me to tune it up. As we talked, he said quietly, "My wife passed away last year. We used to drive this truck everywhere. I just want to keep it running, feels like she's still here when I drive it." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, touched the hood, and told him, "We'll take care of her." When he came back to pick it up, he sat behind the wheel, turned the key, and smiled through tears. "She sounds just like she used to," he whispered. After he drove away, I stood there a long time, wiping my hands on a rag, realizing something simple yet profound. This was what I was meant to do. Not just fix cars, keep memories alive. One quiet Sunday afternoon, I closed the shop early and drove out to the coast. The sky was painted in gold and violet, and the sound of the waves mixed with the hum of the engine. the same old truck I'd restored years ago. I parked by the edge of the shore and sat there, watching the sun melt into the horizon. I thought about the man I used to be, the one who believed his life was over, who sat alone in an empty apartment surrounded by silence. That man had died long ago. In his place stood someone stronger, someone who had learned that failure wasn't the end, but the beginning of something honest. For the first time in my life, I felt free. Not the kind of freedom that comes from running away, but the kind that comes from coming home to yourself. Now, whenever someone asks me, "Aren't you too old for this?" I smile and tell them, engines don't care how old the hands are that fix them, and dreams don't expire just because you've got gray hair. I've learned that every person has two lives. The first begins when we're born, and the second begins when we realize we only get one. And mine began at 61.